Welcome back. After nearly 10 months of detainment in Russia, Brittany Griner walks free in the US due to a prisoner swap. In exchange for Griner, Russian arms dealer Victor Bout was freed, leaving many people with questions and concerns. Richard Stoll, professor of political science at Rice University, joins me to discuss. Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Now, for those who are unaware, can you quickly talk about Brittany Griner's detainment in Russia?
Sure. In February, she was going to be flying out of Russia, and she went through the things we all go through when we get on planes. They look through your luggage and the things you're carrying on, and they found less than a gram of medically prescribed hash oil in her luggage. That is illegal in Russia, and she was arrested for that. She'd been playing in the Russian Premier Basketball League. Um, and she went to trial beginning on July 1st. She pleaded guilty. And on August 4th, she was sentenced to 9 years in prison. And in November, she was transferred to a Russian penal colony.
Now, as I mentioned, she is now free in the US due to a prisoner swap. Can you first talk about what that is and how do they work?
Well, it's basically when two parties, and I say that because in this case, it's two different countries going back and forth between the governments. But there have been cases where, on the one side, you have a government trying to free its citizens, and on the other side, it's a non government group, like, say, a terrorist group. But basically, uh, they have to start communicating with each other, and that might begin publicly, like the US government says, gosh, we really wish that so and so would get released. Then there's usually some kind of a private discussion, and they come to an agreement about what the swap will consist of, who's going to be swapped, something about the conditions under which they'll be swapped.
Now, I want to touch on something that you mentioned. You said that it doesn't always have to be between like two opposing countries. It could be like domesticated or domestic. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We can think of instances where Americans and other foreign nationals have been, I'll say, captured by, say, terrorist groups, and the U.S. government can decide to negotiate with a terrorist group to get Americans released. Of course, the group has to agree to negotiate it, but yeah, people can be held by groups other than governments.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. Now, what does the relationship, if it is between two countries, what does that relationship have to look like in order to do a swap? So, is it always like the US and Russia who have a long, relationship with each other? Does it always have to look like that?
No, first of all, right now there are almost 1,100 Canadians in various prisons in the United States for various crimes. Um, I don't anticipate that the U.S. and the Canadians governments will be negotiating some kind of a swap. It's kind of like, well, they broke America's laws. There was a legitimate legal procedure. They're not going to be mistreated in American prisons, so they'll just have to serve their time. So, it can be a case though where if the relationship is extremely good, like between the U.S. and Canada, there's probably going to be no swap involved. If the relationship is extremely bad, there's probably also not going to be a swap because the two groups aren't even talking. It's kind of in the middle zone. So we do have relations with Russia. We have a serious disagreement, for example, with what's happening in Ukraine, but we still have relations. So that's more typical of when swaps are likely to occur.
Oh, okay. Now, how did the US decide who they were going to swap for Griner?
Well, first of all, let me be clear. I don't have any inside information on this, okay? But just in general, as the two sides talk back and forth, it may be in this case, it was clear the U.S. wanted Reiner. Um, the Russians may have suggested more than one person, but they make their preferences known. The US government has to think, is this okay with us? Do we think this is a reasonable swap? And things may go back and forth until there's an agreement on both sides about what the swap will consist of. We don't know right now whether there was a lot of back and forth about that or whether the Russians from the very beginning insisted on this particular swap.
Now, I know a lot of online users voice concerns about the freeing of a Russian arms dealer. You know, just from your opinion, do you think people should be worried at all?
I don't think it's unfair to be worried about it, but the question is, if we went back and forth with the Russians repeatedly, and they said this is the only person that we will agree to swap Griner for, the U.S. government could say no. Would we be happier if we still had this Russian who did very bad things, but Griner was still in prison? I mean, is that worth it? That's something everybody has to answer for themselves. I don't have a general answer for that.
Now, I want to touch on this. What are the circumstances that would result in a prison swap?
Again, ultimately, both sides have to agree that they have more to be gained from the swap than not swapping. The two sides can have very different preferences, very different senses of what's important and what's not important. But ultimately, they both have to agree we are better off by doing this swap than by not doing it.
Now, I know, like in this country, a lot of people are always vocal about how they feel about things. And for this particular situation, a lot of people are saying that this wasn't really the best idea. One, is this a political, opinion? Like, is it something that is very political? And why do you think people are saying that this isn't the best idea?
Well, I think there's probably several different reasons, but and the two that come to mind are, number one, this American was unjustly imprisoned, but the person we are giving up to get her back did really, really bad things, and that's not a good thing to do. So, from the point of view of at least some Americans, I'm sure they see this as an unfair swap. The other thing to be concerned about is, does the fact that we made a deal now encourage various groups and various countries to seize other Americans just to get the deal they want? Does it? And that would be a bad thing.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Victor. I know people online are giving him this nickname, the Merchant of Death. Do you by any chance know how he got that name? And is that also possibly why people are a little bit afraid about his freedom?
As far as I know, he was a major dealer in arms. And yes, he is a truly bad person. I think most Americans would agree that Griner was innocent, or the worst thing you can say is, even though she had a legal right in the US to have that container, she and her people should have known that it was likely to cause problems in Russia. That's the worst you can say about her. He is a truly bad person. But the question is, again, if the Russians say this is the only way you're getting Griner back, are you willing to let her stay in a terrible prison for a number of years because you don't want to give him up? I think that's a question that every one of us needs to ask themselves, and different people can come to different conclusions.
I also really like that you brought up, that what she did was legal in the US and just overseas that it wasn't considered legal. And I think that is something that a lot of people should think about when they are traveling to places across the world. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I want to move on to someone named Paul Whelan. Who is this? And can you explain why people are now bringing him up?
Yes. He was arrested in December of 2018. He's a former Marine, as we can see from the pictures that you're showing. And he was accused of being a spy and got a 16-year prison sentence. He apparently, according to his brother, and when I say that, it's not like I don't believe his brother, but that's the source of the information. He went to Moscow to attend the wedding of a former fellow Marine, and he was also supposed to be helping out the guests because they'd never been to Russia before. He had been there, and he was arrested and charged with being a spy and convicted and put into prison. I don't know of anyone that believes he was actually a spy. People believe that he was unjustly convicted. And if nothing happens, he's going to be in prison there for a long period of time. So, yes, it would be wonderful if he was released as well. But it appears to be the case that in terms of the Griner swap, that it does appear to be the case. The U.S. government said we would like him as well, but the Russians said no, they didn't want to give him up. And so again, we come back to, from the point of view of the U.S. government, okay, if we can't get both of them back, do we accept what we can get, Griner, or do we walk away and say, unless you're willing to give us both these people back, there is no deal?
Right. Now, Griner was also a WNBA star. I'm curious to know, do you think at all this contributed to her finally receiving her freedom?
Um, uh, it might have had something to do with that, but if we step back and look on the larger scale, we see Americans, quote unquote, ordinary Americans, who also get released. In October, 7 Americans who had been imprisoned in Venezuela were released in return for 2 Venezuelans that the U.S. government had imprisoned, for example. That didn't make the news, or at least it wasn't a major story, because these were ordinary Americans. So that's not a diss against Griner, but someone who is a major figure is more likely to get a major news story. But yes, quote unquote, ordinary Americans have also been released, and the U.S. government works to do that. The person in the U.S. government who is in charge of trying to sort of deal with this says that in the last 8 or 9 months, 15 Americans have been released from various foreign countries.
All right. Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. I definitely learned a lot, so I truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Don't go away. We'll be right back with more Open right after this.